Hey, adapters, welcome back. Our guest today is Dr. Laura Hansen. For over 2 decades, Laura has been a leader in the field of climate adaptation. Her experience includes innovations for both the natural and built environments, developing new tools, training thousands of practitioners, and writing. She thinks climate change is everybody's problem, and she'll keep pushing us all to do more about it. I can speak from personal experience. Laura has been a mentor to me for quite a while on all things adaptation. Laura will introduce us to the climate lens concept and discuss the need for climate change to be part of all planning and decision making. She stresses the importance of understanding local vulnerabilities, how they intensify other challenges, and developing solutions to address those problems. Hey, Laura, welcome to the show.
Hey there, great to be here. Nice to see you, Doug.
Well, what a treat to have you on. You're just an old friend in the adaptation space, and we're going to be talking adaptation. It doesn't get any better than this. So welcome. Okay, let's just start off. We're going to talk about some of the things that you're doing, but what is EcoAdapt? Where are you based out of?
So EcoAdapt is a distributed organization. We're a nonprofit, and we work exclusively in the climate change adaptation space. But we do that with an awareness that adaptation and mitigation need to happen hand in hand. So we're everywhere that people need help working on the challenges that climate change is bringing to their daily existence.
Okay, so I think it's worth acknowledging that you guys have been around a while because adaptation is still a relatively new field. How long have you been at it?
So EcoAdapt started in late 2008. So we've been around for over 12 years. But I've been working in the adaptation space since the beginning of this century.
Right. It's true. 2008 is like a lifetime ago in regards to this topic. I think of how things change in 2 or 3 years. So to your credit, we interacted when I was doing previous things, and so yeah, it's been great following you and keeping, I guess, adaptation front and center. So on that note, why does climate need to be part of planning and decision making?
So as I said before, EcoAdapt's goal is to help people figure out how the challenges of climate change affect what they're doing. And the truth of the matter is, if you were to play a little parlor game, you could say, how does climate change affect transportation? And you could come up with a million ways that it does that. That's true of everything. It's true of housing. It's true of natural resource management. It's true of species conservation. Climate change affects and touches everything in our lives and in our world because it is a global problem. That means that addressing it and being able to do what you do well, be it planning or management, which is pretty much the basis of everything that we do from there, requires incorporating the realities of climate change into it. Otherwise, you're going to come up with solutions that are going to be cut short in their effectiveness in the near future when those impacts of climate change that you haven't been thinking about or didn't want to deal with inhibit the ability to meet your goals.
Okay, so we hear about different groups creating their own adaptation plans, and we're going to get to this, the climate lens. But what's going on there when, let's say, a local government or a business actually creates an adaptation plan?
So it's essentially the same kind of planning you're doing. Adaptation isn't something that stands on its own. Adaptation is at the heart of being able to realize the effectiveness of what you're trying to do. So it's still going to be your community's general or comprehensive plan. It's just going to have climate embedded in it so that you can actually achieve the goals of a comprehensive plan. Things like good land use decisions, transit decisions, housing decisions, water resource management. All of those things are where the base really is of what you're thinking. And then you're considering how climate change affects them. But you also want to do it in a way that is cross-disciplinary. So you don't want to come up with a suite of solutions for agriculture and a different suite of solutions for water and then hope for the best in the end. You need to think about those two things together because climate change will be affecting them both. And if you're planning for agriculture, you need to know how will water be changing. And if you're planning for water management, you need to know how will the agricultural sector or human community use be changing, or wildlife needs to avoid those future conflicts. I mean, classic cases of this without climate change exist all over the place. You can think about a lot of the fisheries management in the Western United States that's at odds with agricultural and water needs and how that planning has not played out well. The goal of climate change adaptation in some way is to also say, how do we correct some of those past mistakes that we made in how we were planning in silos and plan in a more holistic manner? So the same thing is true on the conservation side of the coin. Or if you're a business and you're planning for, we want to plan a 20-year growth strategy or a 20-year stay the same strategy, you still need to consider, how will climate change affect the supply chain? How will climate change affect the demand for what it is you're producing, or change the needs in that? It's really just figuring out how we do it, what we're doing in a changing world. I think there's a sector called futurists, and it's really not that different than it, but it's really thinking explicitly about the climate impact piece.
Okay, so let's talk about how adaptations evolved a bit. So back in, when I was doing it a bit more, and especially in the natural resource sector, you get a bunch of people together and it seemed like it was the same thing, and not to knock it, but it was like, all right, to do it, let's do a vulnerability assessment, and maybe we'll throw in some scenario planning in the mix, and then you're going to spit out an adaptation plan. Is that still generally how things are done? And what's your observations on how it's evolved, even when we were doing that in the late aughts and such?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about this is that it is not rocket science, but it is complicated. But that is the general gist of it. You need to understand what are the what are the threats, what are the stresses that you're going to experience, what are the vulnerabilities that those stresses cause, and then what could you possibly do to reduce those vulnerabilities? You could do it as a straight vulnerability assessment where you just go through and look at the data. Some people do them as scenario planning to say, okay, what do we think are the most likely scenarios and how would we prepare for those? All completely legitimate and well-used approaches still to this day. The biggest issue that has been moving forward is really getting at this multiple stressor way of thinking about it, so that we're not creating solutions in silos. That's probably been the greatest advance since early days. Early days, you can go back and find vulnerability assessments where they simply looked at even just one climate stress, like we're just going to look at sea level rise. Even though clearly sea level rise is happening in concert with precipitation change and temperature change and human population movement and development pressures. Now putting those things together is becoming more common, and also adding into it very explicitly an equity lens to consider how will more vulnerable populations be impacted by this, and how will their adaptive capacity be lower than it might be for other groups because of simply access to resources, but also in some very specific locations, access and uptake of things like insurance, which are one of the main tools we've been using against the damage of climate change.
I'm having, flashbacks of some of that adaptation planning. And when you were doing a vulnerability assessment, you got Josh Lawler from the university. Is he still at University of Washington?
He is still there.
Yeah, he was the vulnerability assessment guy. And so many more people are into that space now, but it seemed like a few of the similar characters were getting involved with that. Yep. Okay, so climate change is already this big issue. Why consider additional local challenges at the same time?
Because climate change isn't happening in a vacuum. All of this stuff has already been going on, and climate change is either exacerbating it or being exacerbated by it. And if you want to avoid additional climate harm, you need to address both of those things. So you need to think about, is what we're doing causing more greenhouse gas emissions? We should reduce that because it's only going to cause us more problems later. And will those changes in the environment make it harder to provide affordable housing? So affordable housing is one of my favorite things to talk about, because obviously we have a national housing challenge, and a lot of it is around how do we build or maintain affordable housing. But with climate change, a lot of that affordable housing is going to become very unaffordable because of the cost of utilities, or it's going to become very unhealthy because of the inability to apply the utilities that you need in terms of extreme weather events, in terms of flooding, in terms of leaks. So those energy costs, those repair costs, and those health costs all will change the face of what affordable housing is, if in fact we're not planning for that in its design and maintenance over time.
Okay, so you've talked a little bit about it, but what is Climate Lens? What do you mean by that? What is that process?
So whenever anyone makes a decision, if they're in the private industry, if they're in local government, if they're in conservation, if they're at an NGO like mine, when you make those decisions, you apply some kinds of lenses to them. You make sure you have enough staff to do them. You make sure that you have the funds to do them. We have requirements that make sure you're not adversely damaging the environment when you do them, or you're not excluding groups that shouldn't be excluded from the decision making. We have an array of lenses that we put into making a good decision so that it has the most benefit and the least harm. Climate is currently not in the mix of how those decisions are made. So money is spent on infrastructure that has 50 and 100-year lifespans, but we don't consider how will the climate change over the lifetime of that piece of infrastructure. And as a result, we're building vulnerable things. So a climate lens, and it's not just about building, it's about all sorts of land use management decisions, moving into floodplains, moving into areas that are more growing fire risk. A climate lens is a tool that you use at that early onset where you actually evaluate what the climate risk is going to be, and you determine whether or not you're willing to make that decision based on that risk level. And perhaps you'll set up some sort of response in advance, like you'll put in place a bond to decommission something that's built in harm's way for flooding or sea level rise. Or you will provide, you'll build to a higher building standard, or you'll put in some other sort of insurance policy, not proper insurance, although it could be, in order to make sure that the project or decision has the least harm and the greatest good for the longest time.
Okay, so let's say you're actually dealing with clients or a customer. Would you describe climate lens as something different than an adaptation plan, or they're kind of just interchangeable?
Well, so it's a little bit more all-encompassing. So of a single project. So you would use a client, whereas you would use a vulnerability assessment to consider a sector or an area of work or a geographic location. A climate lens gets used for making an individual decision. When the staff at a city planning office or the staff at a resource management office has to make a decision about a particular permit or a particular capital expenditure or a particular policy change, you would use a climate lens to assess that individual action to understand both its impact from climate change and its impact to climate change, and try to mitigate or ameliorate both.
All right, let's dig into that further, though. Just this notion of going through this climate lens process. Let's say you're a planner within a mid-sized city, and they really don't have much of a climate program. How does that person even get started?
Right. So that's exactly why we started working on this. So we'd worked with a couple of communities on updating their comprehensive plans, and realized that from there, they didn't know how to operationalize it. So we discussed with them, how is it that you make decisions now? How do you evaluate permits and projects? And we created an analogous tool that they just build into that process. So it's a tool that anyone who works on planning or decision making can use, because it asks you simple questions that have nothing to do with climate, but they're indicative of a climate impact or vulnerability. If you say yes to any of them, you are then directed to do an evaluation, to actually look at some climate data. We tell people where to go and get that. And what kind of question to ask, and then let them evaluate, is that a level of, when they look at that, is that a level of risk they're willing to live with? And then the third step is actually to work with those city staffers that are currently under-resourced, and have them make a decision. So the tool itself, we actually see as something that the city staff, the understaffed city department, doesn't necessarily have to do. It may in fact be, if it's a project from outside of the city, a proponent of the project could be tasked with doing it, just like they're tasked with doing an environmental impact assessment, for example. But if it's an internal project, then yeah, city staff should probably take it on. If you're going to do a capital expenditure of taxpayer dollars, let's find out if that's going to live through the expected lifetime of the project. So it's self-guided, very simple. We've actually had people test it, and it can be done in just a few hours.
Okay, so we both have gone through that experience. A lot of times it's just that ambitious person within that department or that organization who cares about this issue that they go out of their way to actually make this happen. And it obviously needs to scale up much more than that. This climate lens concept, I mean, do you see potential nodes where, like something like, I think every city planner has to think about NEPA, and you do environmental assessment, things that are just required, that are baked into the system.
Yep.
Do you see any opportunities there?
Yeah, I mean, that is the hope. I mean, getting it to be a requirement. So a number of states now require the incorporation of climate into a general planning process, which should set it up that if your general plan says that you have to be addressing and planning for climate change, that sort of says you need tools on a daily basis to enact the climate, those parts of the comprehensive plan. So that it was our original dream, is that this would be adopted perhaps starting at a county level and then work its way up to the state level. But there's also perhaps opportunity now with the current federal administration that it could become a requirement in things that receive federal funding.
Well, I guess too, with the stimulus that they're talking about, a lot of people are talking behind the scenes of what's going to go into that legislation. Seems like there's an opportunity there, but even infrastructure spending, there it goes. But I mean, it remains to be seen what kind of gets in there. But I guess after the fact, bringing climate lens into that discussion, do you even as an organization have a strategy around that? Because it just seems like there's a window here over the next year. There
is absolutely a window, and we have been talking to a lot of people at a lot of different levels of this process, because that is absolutely our goal. Is if in fact, I mean, there have been there were executive orders or an executive order under the Obama administration that has now been recapitulated under the Biden administration that requires this incorporation of climate into all agencies and all agency work. And the climate lens is really the next logical step of that, because you have to have a way to ensure that it's happening. Otherwise, it goes back to some of the early days of adaptation, where there would be requirements like consider climate change, which could simply be a sentence in a report saying, we considered climate change, period.
Right. I've seen those. I've seen it. We should consider the future impacts of climate change and stop. That was it. Gosh, yes, I do remember those. Well, there must also be opportunities too, because as more sectors are ramping up their adaptation efforts, you think of the planning, what is it? The Planning Association. What's the national planning group?
The American Planning Association, the APA.
You must know some people there. Are they thinking like this? Is the climate lens, is it a format that they could say, you know what, we want to take this and we're going to, because they do all sorts of certifications and trainings and such.
Yep, we have actually provided a training on the tool at both the Washington State and the national versions of the APA. And that is one of the groups that we're talking with. They're also a partner with us on the National Adaptation Forum as part of their trainings.
Excellent. Now, it's a victory in itself. Like the original victory was they even put a line in there about climate change. The next victory is that they're doing more sophisticated adaptation planning. But
Yep.
let's look out 5-10 years of them doing this for a while. Doing adaptation planning doesn't necessarily mean you're doing proper adaptation planning and maladaptation. What have you encountered that enough? Well, I guess some groups have been doing it long enough. What do you do in that sort of situation?
Right. I mean, the biggest challenge in the adaptation world is sort of the tension between green and gray infrastructure adaptation. That's sort of the place where you see the biggest difference of opinion in what is good adaptation. There's certainly a heavy reliance on gray infrastructure adaptation, like we'll just build a seawall, or we'll build another levee, or we'll put in more pumps, or we'll engineer our way out of this. And the challenge with the engineered solution is that it almost always comes at a cost to natural systems. And they also tend to be a little bit more brittle in terms of their ability to respond. Whereas natural systems, if you were to take advantage of wetlands and floodplains as part of your flood control instead of levees, they have a little bit more of a natural ability to respond and either expand or contract than the hard infrastructure pieces do. And the hard infrastructure pieces cost a lot of money. And if we were to, it's called armoring, if we were to armor every community in the United States against climate threats, first of all, I suspect there are places that a lot of people wouldn't want to live anymore.
Right.
And secondly, it would be incredibly expensive. There would be continued costs to sort of build it up to continue to escalate with the challenges.
I don't know if you agree with this, but my own sense of things, when I first started in the mid-aughts, it seemed like the natural resource sector really was the ones leading on adaptation planning, which was, kind of exciting. Yeah. And then the last 7 to 8 years is more of the built environment, the infrastructure got their heads around it. The natural resource sector, I think, took a back seat, but I'm slightly encouraged, and I don't know if I'm reading the trends right, but I just feel like nature-based solutions to like adaptation, it seems like that's been roaring back a bit in the last year or two, that people are like, wait a sec, let's consider these approaches. And I think they kind of disappeared for a while. And I'm curious your observations, because you've been with the natural resource sector for a while.
Yeah, I think, internationally, nature-based solutions have maintained a fairly high level of engagement and recognition. And even more, I think that the natural resource management side of adaptation has maintained pretty steady. It had a big head start, but you're right, it is now being sort of overwhelmed by the amount of awareness and conversation around community-based adaptation. And part of that's just because people live in communities and that's what we see firsthand. We don't see as much the other pieces that are going on. That there is the hope that this new emergence and new realization of both the cost savings and the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions will make them more attractive, especially to smaller and more rural communities, because they have the space to really take advantage of them. But in other cases, you can think of New York City as actually having developed some nature-based solutions long ago when it created its water resources up in upstate New York. Thinking about larger communities, and I refer to them as their sheds, so their watershed, their food shed, their energy shed. Those things don't tend to come from within a city. They come from the surrounding areas. And so how do you build as part of your adaptation? And they're almost all predicated on some sort of natural resource, be it a fossil fuel or renewable. For energy, obviously agriculture requires a natural resource. It requires land and soil, and water clearly requires water. So that thinking about those and how you can use nature-based solutions to ensure those resources is really important, and quite frankly, the more affordable long-term thing, including that it's also protecting those natural systems, which provide so many ecosystem services that people don't even build into those economic analyses of how much does it cost to have water, for example.
Great point about New York. Okay, so we're at the end of the episode here, but I did want to get a couple more quick questions in here. You guys are at the heart of the National Adaptation Forum, and I just wanted you to what is that? If people are not familiar with the National Adaptation Forum, what's going on there? I know it was delayed, but what's it all about?
Yeah, okay, so the National Adaptation Forum is really the place where national level conversations happen about adaptation in the United States. By everyone who works on adaptation. So these are not just high-level policymakers on adaptation. These are not just scientists on adaptation. These are policymakers, scientists, community members, interested artists. We have artists come to these events, and it's a national level conversation about how should we be preparing for and responding to climate change and increasing the demand and pressure for mitigation. I often refer to climate change adaptation as the gateway drug to get people to care about mitigation. And it really is, because once you see how big the challenges are for your community or the resource you care about, the only real solution is to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions. So the forum is a biennial event that brings that community together to innovate, share ideas, share lessons, provide moral support to each other. It was postponed. It was supposed to happen this spring, I think, like in a month and a half. But we had to cancel it, obviously, because of the pandemic and people's inability to attend. In the interim, we are doing virtual forums. So they're individual tracks. We did one on displacement caused by climate change. And we're doing one on heat that I believe an announcement came out today about heat stress in urban settings, rural settings, and for natural resources. So it's essentially 3 sessions of the forum online. And then we've postponed the next forum until 2022. Our hope is that in 2022, we will have the ability to meet in person again. But until then, we'll be bringing people together online to share ideas and lessons and build community.
Well, I just want to put my own plug, the National Adaptation Forum. It is a chance. There's other people out there doing adaptation, and I've been to every one, I think, except for the inaugural one in Denver. I was a Fed at the time. They weren't letting us travel up anywhere. So It's a great event. I was very sad that it was delayed, but it was the obvious decision to do. And I hope that Simpatico can play some sort of role, because it's coverage that we'd love to do here on Simpatico, because it's all people doing adaptation. So looking forward to that. Laura, always a pleasure. I'm going to take you into just chatting, but want to thank you for what you're doing, and want to thank you for coming on Simpatico.
An absolute pleasure. And everyone is welcome to be part of the National Adaptation Forum. Check it out and join online.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'm going to just take you into just chatting, but we'll be right back. Okay, we are back, Laura. We just like to close out the episode. That blew by. 24 minutes. That was great. I was going to ask
you. You said it
would. I was going to ask you, but I didn't want to prompt you because we're going a little bit. But and for people still listening too, could you just describe CAKE? What is CAKE?
CAKE is your online adaptation destination. It is the largest database of climate change adaptation content in the world. Cakex.org is an open access place to both post and find case studies, so examples of what people are doing on the ground, guidance documents or reports on what it is you learned in the adaptation work you did. And there's also a directory, so you can find other people who are working on adaptation. And it's all geo-referenced, so there's a map you can go to and find either content or people near you.
Okay, great. I think I probably need to update my information in CAKE. I don't know. I think when I first signed in, I was maybe in Florida when I first signed it. It's been around a while though, right?
It has been around a while. It's been around since 2010. It is now, the 11th anniversary.
Do you have a visual element? So like what we do here, we create these television shows. Do you have that at CAKE? I haven't poked around for stuff like that. Is that just sort of like...
So there is at least one image for every item that is in CAKE. And some of them actually have links to video and brief stories about them. We've always wanted to do more of that, but as you know, that's an expensive endeavor. And most of our partners wouldn't have the funds to do that. So a couple people, I think, have some links to video, but there's not a lot.
All right, I'm thinking of a partnership there. There's this opportunity here because I was looking around at CAKE earlier, and it's just a massive trove of information and such, and just a lot of it is like with toolkits and stuff. How it's being used, who's seeing it, and in what way. So we've always struggled of like getting in a way that people are going to consume it. So
and we're actually planning some big updates in the coming year and a half around just that. We want to provide people more guidance on this is how this person did this, and this is how you can do it.
Very cool. Well, Laura, I hope that we actually can get you on Simpatico again. Maybe there's a particular project or whatever, just getting you on and having it's, as you can see, it's easy. You're flipping on StreamYard, and it's hopefully not that too much of a time, and you've done all the production side of it. So getting you on a regular basis would be super cool.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm about to go into another interview with Sherry Goodman on national security and climate change.
Oh, great.
So if you're interested, but
always a timely issue.
Oh, I know. All of the executive orders last week were just keeping everybody busy. So catching up with some of those things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, you can sign out of StreamYard, but thanks again, Laura. I'll talk to you later. And this should be available, just the episode, the completed one, hopefully within the next few days. But we'll have it sent to you, and we'll just share on various social media.
Super. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Thanks for producing this.
Say hi to the cat. Hey, everybody. That was great. Laura's an old friend, and always excited to get a chance to talk to her. I actually don't get to talk to her that much. She was one of the first people I connected with in the adaptation space at Snowbird, Utah. It's where I met her, and we had a lovely conversation around what's going on in the field. And that was back in the aughts. And so I am going to jump off just because we have to get ready for our next episode coming up. I've got Sherry Goodman, the godmother of national security and climate change. So if you're out there watching, please stick around. That's going to be a great conversation. She is being, I think, well, she's very busy lately with everything that's going on with the new Biden administration. So looking forward to that conversation. National security and climate change, it's kind of blowing up as an issue. All right. Talk to everybody later.